the Senate hearing chamber descended into absolute silence as Representative Jamie Raskin stood from his seat, holding a single document that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Kash Patel's confirmation hearing. The document in question contained a straightforward query that Patel had successfully evaded for the previous 2 hours through carefully constructed responses and procedural deflections. What occurred in the subsequent 5 minutes represented one of the most dramatic confrontations in recent congressional history. Raskin, a constitutional law professor turned congressman with a reputation for prosecutorial precision, had methodically trapped Trump's FBI director nominee into a corner from which there existed no viable escape route. The packed gallery, filled with journalists from major news organizations and political observers, witnessed in real time as Patel's composed demeanor disintegrated under the weight of a question that demanded only 2 possible responses. The stakes could not have been higher. Patel's confirmation represented a critical component of the incoming administration's law enforcement strategy. His opponents characterized him as a political operative seeking to weaponize federal law enforcement. His supporters viewed him as a necessary reformer who would restore integrity to institutions they believed had been corrupted. Both perspectives converged on the single moment when Raskin rose to speak. Before examining the specific mechanics of how this confrontation unfolded and the broader implications for American governance, I encourage viewers to subscribe to this channel and activate notifications to ensure continued access to comprehensive political analysis. Please indicate in the comments section your geographic location, as understanding our audience demographics enhances our content delivery strategy. Representative Jamie Raskin approached the witness table with the measured deliberation that characterized his legal background. At 71 years old, the Maryland Democrat brought to this hearing 3 decades of constitutional law expertise accumulated through his tenure as a professor at American University's Washington College of Law. His reputation for methodical questioning, honed through his role as lead impeachment manager during Trump's second impeachment trial, made him one of the most formidable interrogators in congressional oversight. Raskin's personal history added particular weight to his participation in this hearing. Having lost his son to suicide just days before the January 6th Capitol attack, then having survived that attack itself while serving as impeachment manager, Raskin embodied a unique combination of personal tragedy and professional determination. His colleagues on both sides of the aisle acknowledged his intellectual rigor, even when they disagreed with his political conclusions. Seated across from him, Kash Patel maintained the outward appearance of confidence that had served him throughout his career in government service and conservative media. At 44 years old, Patel had constructed a public persona centered on unwavering loyalty to Trump and aggressive opposition to what he termed the administrative state. His background included service as a federal prosecutor, a House Intelligence Committee investigator, and senior roles in both the Defense Department and Office of the Director of National Intelligence during Trump's first administration. Patel had spent considerable time preparing for this confirmation hearing. His team had conducted extensive mock sessions, anticipating questions about his controversial statements regarding prosecuting journalists, his promotion of conspiracy theories, and his apparent conflicts of interest. What they had not adequately prepared for was the methodical trap that Raskin had been constructing throughout the hearing through seemingly innocuous preliminary questions. The specific issue at hand concerned the classified documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's network and connections. These files, which remained sealed under various legal authorities, had become a subject of intense public interest and political speculation. Multiple congressional members had advocated for their declassification, while intelligence and law enforcement officials maintained that releasing the information would compromise ongoing investigations and reveal sensitive sources and methods. Patel had previously made public statements suggesting that as FBI director, he would pursue aggressive declassification of documents related to political controversies. These statements had energized his conservative base while alarming national security professionals who worried about the potential compromise of intelligence operations. The question of whether he would declassify Epstein-related materials represented a test case for how he would balance political pressures against institutional responsibilities. For the previous 2 hours, Patel had successfully navigated questions about these files through carefully calibrated responses. When Democrats pressed him on whether he would release the documents, he cited the need to review materials before making determinations. When Republicans asked whether he would be transparent, he affirmed his commitment to appropriate disclosure. His answers possessed sufficient ambiguity to avoid firm commitments, while satisfying supporters that he maintained their priorities. Raskin had observed this pattern with the patience of someone who understood that effective interrogation required proper foundation. Rather than immediately demanding clear answers, he had spent his initial questioning establishing what Patel had said publicly, what he claimed to believe about transparency, and what he understood about the legal frameworks governing classified information. Each response Patel provided added another element to the framework Raskin was constructing. The hearing room itself reflected the gravity of the proceedings. Every major news network maintained continuous coverage. The gallery held not just journalists, but also victims' advocates, former intelligence officials, and political operatives from both parties monitoring how their interests might be affected. Social media platforms tracked the hearing in real time, with various hashtags trending as different moments gained traction with online audiences. As Raskin prepared to ask his definitive question, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted perceptibly. Experienced congressional observers recognized the signs of a prepared confrontation. Raskin's body language indicated he was transitioning from foundational questioning to decisive engagement. Patel's attorney, seated behind him, leaned forward with visible concern. Republican committee members exchanged glances, uncertain about what was coming, but sensing that the dynamics were about to change dramatically. Raskin began his final line of questioning with deceptive simplicity. He established that Patel understood the committee required clear answers on matters of significant public interest. He confirmed that Patel recognized his obligation to provide truthful testimony. He verified that Patel comprehended the importance of the FBI director position and the need for that individual to operate with transparency regarding their intentions. Each confirmation built additional pressure, creating a rhetorical structure from which deviation would prove impossible. The congressman then systematically reviewed Patel's previous public statements. He played video clips of Patel appearing on conservative media outlets, declaring his intention to declassify documents that he believed the administrative state had hidden from the American people. He highlighted written statements where Patel had criticized what he characterized as excessive secrecy in government operations. He referenced Patel's book, which contained passages advocating for radical transparency in law enforcement and intelligence operations. Patel attempted to contextualize these statements. He explained that his comments reflected general principles rather than specific commitments. He noted that any FBI director must balance transparency with legitimate classification needs. He emphasized that he would consult with appropriate officials before making declassification decisions. His responses demonstrated rhetorical skill, acknowledging his previous statements while creating sufficient ambiguity to avoid firm commitments. Raskin allowed these explanations without interruption, a strategic decision that would prove significant. He permitted Patel to establish his position that context mattered, that nuance existed, that general statements should not be interpreted as absolute commitments. Each qualification Patel offered provided additional material that Raskin would subsequently use to devastating effect. The congressman then transitioned to the specific matter of the Epstein files. He established that these documents existed, that they contained information about individuals who had interacted with Epstein's network, and that various parties had requested their release. He confirmed that Patel was aware of these requests and had made public comments suggesting sympathy for transparency regarding these materials. Patel acknowledged these facts, maintaining his composed demeanor while his attorney continued to display increasing concern. Raskin proceeded to describe the contents of the files in general terms, based on classified briefings he had received as a member of the House Oversight Committee. Without disclosing specific classified information, he conveyed that the documents contained details about individuals in positions of significant power and influence. He noted that some of these individuals maintained relationships with current political figures. He emphasized that the information, if released without proper redaction, could compromise ongoing investigations into related matters. This description created a dilemma for Patel. If he committed to releasing the files without qualification, he would be pledging to potentially compromise sensitive investigations and expose intelligence sources. If he refused to commit to release, he would contradict his previous public statements and alienate the conservative base that supported him precisely because they believed he would pursue such transparency. The trap Raskin had constructed was becoming increasingly apparent to observers in the hearing room. Patel attempted to maintain his middle position. He stated that he would make decisions about these specific files after reviewing them as FBI director, consulting with appropriate officials, and considering all relevant factors. He emphasized that he could not commit to specific actions regarding documents he had not personally examined. His response represented sound bureaucratic practice, but it fundamentally contradicted the aggressive transparency persona he had cultivated in conservative media. Raskin then introduced a new element into the discussion. He revealed that he possessed written communications from Patel's transition team to conservative media figures, in which Patel's representatives had specifically discussed his plans regarding the Epstein files. These communications, obtained through the transition team's own press outreach, indicated that Patel intended to make declassification of these documents a priority action upon confirmation. The communications characterized this decision as already made, pending only the formality of Senate confirmation. The hearing room erupted as Raskin entered these communications into the record. Republican committee members objected that transition team communications should not be considered binding commitments. Democratic members countered that communications made by official representatives reflected the nominee's intentions. The chairman called for order, but the damage to Patel's carefully constructed ambiguity had been inflicted. The disconnect between his public positioning and his testimony had been exposed. Patel's attorney requested a brief recess to consult with his client. The chairman denied this request, noting that Patel had been testifying for hours and should be prepared to address questions about his own positions. Raskin pressed forward, asking whether the transition team communications accurately reflected Patel's intentions or whether they represented unauthorized statements by overzealous staff members. Either answer would prove problematic. Confirming the communications' accuracy would contradict his testimony about needing to review materials before deciding. Disavowing them would suggest he lacked control over his own team. Patel attempted to split the difference. He suggested that the communications reflected general principles but not specific commitments, that staff members sometimes simplified complex positions for external audiences, and that he maintained ultimate decision-making authority regardless of what his team had communicated to others. This response satisfied no one. Republicans looked uncomfortable with the implication that Patel's team operated without proper oversight. Democrats seized on the contradiction between his campaign rhetoric and his hearing testimony. The tension in the room had reached a critical threshold. Raskin had successfully demonstrated that Patel had made specific commitments to conservative media and supporters regarding the Epstein files, while simultaneously testifying to the committee that he maintained complete flexibility on these matters. The stage had been set for the definitive confrontation that would define not just this hearing, but potentially Patel's entire nomination. Representative Raskin paused, allowing the chaotic atmosphere in the hearing room to settle. He placed his hands on the desk before him, leaning forward slightly, and posed the question that would become the defining moment of the entire proceeding. Mr. Patel, I am going to ask you a very simple question that requires a very simple answer. Not context, not consultation, not review, just yes or no. Will you commit under oath to this committee that if confirmed as FBI director, you will release the unredacted Epstein files to the public within your first 90 days in office? Yes or no? The simplicity of the question masked its sophistication. Raskin had constructed a perfect binary choice that eliminated all the rhetorical escape routes Patel had been using. Answering yes would mean committing to an action that could compromise investigations, violate classification protocols, and potentially obstruct justice. Answering no would mean betraying the expectations of the conservative base that viewed his willingness to release these documents as a litmus test for his fitness for office. The hearing room fell silent. Every camera focused on Patel's face. His expression, which had maintained studied confidence throughout the hearing, began to show visible stress. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted briefly to his attorney, who could offer no assistance in this moment. The silence extended, becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Congressional hearings typically moved rapidly, with witnesses prepared with immediate responses. This extended pause signaled to everyone present that something extraordinary was occurring. After what felt like an eternity but was actually approximately 15 seconds, Patel spoke. "Congressman, I appreciate the question, but I cannot commit to releasing specific documents without reviewing them first. As I have stated repeatedly, I would need to consult with." Raskin interrupted immediately. "Mr. Patel, I did not ask what you need to review. I did not ask about consultation. I asked a yes or no question. Will you release the unredacted Epstein files within 90 days? Yes or no?" The interruption, while potentially viewed as discourteous in normal circumstances, served a specific strategic purpose. It prevented Patel from retreating into the qualified responses that had characterized his testimony. It forced him to confront the fundamental contradiction between his public persona and the institutional responsibilities of the position he sought. Patel tried again. "Congressman, responsible leadership requires. Yes or no, Mr. Patel, will you release the files? Yes or no?" The Republican chairman attempted to intervene. The witness should be permitted to provide complete answers to questions posed to him. Raskin responded without breaking eye contact with Patel. "Mr. Chairman, with respect, the witness has been providing incomplete answers for 2 hours. I am asking for a direct commitment on a matter of significant public interest. If Mr. Patel cannot provide a yes or no answer to a yes or no question, that itself tells this committee and the American people everything they need to know about his candor." The procedural exchange bought Patel a few additional seconds, but it also reinforced Raskin's point. The contrast between Patel's aggressive public statements and his unwillingness to make firm commitments under oath had been rendered undeniable. Republican committee members, who had been prepared to defend Patel against what they anticipated would be partisan attacks, found themselves unable to contest the fundamental reasonableness of requesting a clear answer to a clear question. Patel made his decision. "Congressman, my answer is that I will commit to reviewing those files and making appropriate determinations based on." "So your answer is no. You will not commit to releasing them. Is that correct?" The room erupted again. Democratic committee members began speaking simultaneously, some thanking Raskin for extracting clarity, others demanding that Patel explain the contradiction between his testimony and his public statements. Republican members objected to what they characterized as a prosecutorial approach inappropriate for a confirmation hearing. Conservative observers in the gallery began heckling, accusing Raskin of setting a trap. Liberal observers countered that Patel had trapped himself through his own contradictory positions. Amid this chaos, television cameras captured Patel's face in close-up. The composed confidence that had characterized his public appearances had vanished. His skin appeared flushed. His hands, which he had kept carefully still throughout the hearing, now gripped the edge of the witness table. His breathing had become visibly deeper. These physical manifestations of stress, broadcast in real time to millions of viewers, would become the lasting image of this confrontation. Patel attempted to regain control. "Congressman Raskin, I reject your characterization of my testimony. I have been completely consistent in stating that I support transparency while recognizing the need for appropriate procedures. If you are attempting to suggest that responsible decision-making regarding classified materials constitutes some form of betrayal of principles, I fundamentally disagree with that premise." Raskin remained unmoved. "Mr. Patel, you have told conservative media audiences that you will release these files. You have allowed your transition team to make specific commitments about your intentions. You have written in your book about the need for radical transparency. But now, under oath, before this committee, you refuse to make that commitment. The question for this committee is straightforward. Were you misleading your supporters when you suggested you would release these files, or are you misleading this committee now when you say you need to review them first?" The question represented a prosecutorial technique known as a false dilemma, forcing the witness to choose between two unfavorable options. However, the technique succeeded here because Patel had created the dilemma himself through his contradictory statements. He had positioned himself as someone who would take decisive action on these files while simultaneously maintaining the bureaucratic flexibility to avoid commitment. Patel's attorney finally intervened directly, leaning into the microphone. "Congressman, my client has been testifying for over 2 hours. These questions are becoming repetitive and argumentative. If you have genuine questions about his positions, perhaps we could approach them in a manner that permits nuanced discussion rather than demanding oversimplified yes or no responses to complex policy matters." Raskin's response came immediately. "Counselor, the question of whether your client will release specific documents is not complex. It is binary. He either will or will not. The complexity exists only because your client has made contradictory statements that he is now attempting to reconcile. If he had been consistent from the beginning, we would not be having this discussion." The attorney attempted to respond, but the chairman gavelled the hearing back to order. "The witness will answer the congressman's question. Mr. Patel, can you provide a clear statement of your position regarding the Epstein files?" Patel took a deep breath, clearly understanding that any response he provided would be weaponized against him. He chose his words with visible care. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my position is and has always been that the American people deserve transparency regarding government operations. At the same time, that transparency must be balanced against legitimate national security concerns and ongoing investigative needs. I cannot, in good conscience, commit to releasing specific documents without first reviewing them to understand what those documents contain, what investigations they might affect, and what sources and methods they might compromise. If that position is characterized as inconsistent with my public statements about transparency, I would note that responsible governance always requires balancing principles against practical realities." The response represented Patel's most articulate statement of his position during the entire hearing. It acknowledged the tension between his rhetoric and his responsibilities. It provided a framework for understanding his apparent contradiction. However, it also represented a complete retreat from the aggressive transparency persona that had made him attractive to Trump and the conservative base. Raskin allowed a moment of silence before delivering his conclusion. "Mr. Patel, I appreciate your clarification. You have confirmed that despite your public statements, despite your book, despite your transition team's communications to conservative media, you are not actually committed to releasing the Epstein files. You will make that decision based on a review process that, as we all understand, provides ample opportunity to find reasons not to release information. This is, in fact, the standard bureaucratic approach that you have spent your public career criticizing. The question this committee must consider is whether someone who promises radical transparency in public but retreats to bureaucratic caution under oath can be trusted with the extraordinary power of the FBI director position." The conclusion of this exchange marked the effective end of Patel's confirmation prospects. While the hearing continued for another hour, and while various senators asked additional questions, the fundamental damage had been done. Patel had been revealed as someone whose public rhetoric did not align with his sworn testimony. Conservative supporters who had championed him for his commitment to transparency had watched him equivocate and retreat when pressed for specific commitments. Moderate senators who had been willing to consider his nomination had seen him demonstrate either a willingness to mislead the public or an inability to maintain consistent positions under pressure. The immediate reaction to the Raskin-Patel confrontation demonstrated the partisan divide that characterized American politics. Conservative media outlets framed the exchange as prosecutorial harassment, with commentators arguing that Raskin had employed unfair tactics to entrap a qualified nominee. Liberal outlets characterized it as necessary accountability, pointing out that Patel had created his own problems through contradictory statements. The divergent narratives illustrated how the same factual events could be interpreted through fundamentally different frameworks depending on political orientation. Social media platforms experienced the predictable explosion of commentary. The hashtag #PatelPanic began trending within minutes, accompanied by video clips showing Patel's visible discomfort during Raskin's questioning. Conservative accounts countered with Raskin ambush, arguing that the congressman had violated norms of senatorial courtesy. The debate about whether Raskin's tactics were appropriate overshadowed, in some spaces, the substantive question of whether Patel's contradictory positions disqualified him from leading the FBI. Within the Senate itself, the impact proved more consequential. Several Republican senators who had been prepared to support Patel's nomination privately expressed concerns to leadership. These senators, many of whom faced re-election in competitive states, worried about defending a nominee who appeared to have misled either the public or Congress about his intentions. The Senate Majority Leader faced pressure from both the White House, which wanted Patel confirmed, and from vulnerable members who saw his nomination as a political liability. The White House response followed a predictable pattern. Initial statements defended Patel, characterizing Raskin's questioning as partisan theater. Press secretary statements emphasized Patel's qualifications and his commitment to reforming the FBI. However, behind the scenes, transition officials began quietly developing contingency plans. Multiple sources reported that names of alternative FBI director candidates began circulating within the administration, a clear signal that Patel's nomination faced serious jeopardy. The broader implications for FBI independence emerged as a central theme in subsequent analysis. Legal scholars noted that an FBI director who had committed publicly to releasing specific documents before reviewing them would be compromising the Bureau's institutional integrity. Former FBI officials, both Republican and Democratic appointees, published statements emphasizing that the director must maintain independence from political pressures. The concern extended beyond Patel, specifically to the question of whether any political loyalist could appropriately lead a law enforcement institution that required operational independence. The Epstein files themselves became the subject of renewed public interest. Multiple media organizations filed Freedom of Information Act requests seeking the documents. Victims' advocates argued that transparency about Epstein's network served the public interest. Intelligence officials countered through background briefings that premature release could compromise ongoing investigations into related trafficking networks. The policy debate about appropriate transparency in sensitive investigations gained new urgency. Legal analysts examined whether Patel's testimony created potential legal exposure. His public statements about his intentions, combined with his equivocal hearing testimony, raised questions about whether he had made material misrepresentations to Congress or to the public. Several former federal prosecutors noted that, while criminal charges seemed unlikely, the inconsistencies provided ammunition for senators who opposed his confirmation. The Democratic strategy of forcing yes or no responses to complex questions received both praise and criticism from political observers. Supporters argued that it represented effective oversight, forcing nominees to take clear positions rather than hiding behind bureaucratic language. Critics contended that it oversimplified genuinely complex policy questions and created artificial binary choices where nuance was appropriate. The methodological debate reflected deeper disagreements about the proper role of Senate confirmation hearings in evaluating nominees. Republican senators faced particular difficulty in responding to the situation. They could not effectively defend Patel's contradictory statements without appearing to condone either misleading the public or misleading Congress. They could not attack Raskin's questioning without appearing to oppose basic accountability. Several chose to simply avoid commenting on the exchange, hoping the controversy would diminish. Others attempted to reframe the debate as being about FBI reform generally rather than about Patel's specific credibility. Former Trump administration officials divided in their assessments. Some defended Patel, arguing that his commitment to transparency remained genuine even if his confirmation testimony reflected appropriate caution. Others privately acknowledged that his performance had been damaging, suggesting that his inexperience with Senate procedure had led him to create unnecessary problems for himself. The division reflected broader tensions within the conservative movement about whether loyalty to Trump required defending all his nominees regardless of their qualifications or conduct. The victims' advocacy community responded with particular intensity. Organizations representing survivors of trafficking expressed outrage that the Epstein files had become a political football rather than being treated as evidence in ongoing justice efforts. Several victim advocates testified at subsequent hearings, arguing that both Patel's politicization of the issue and the Senate's focus on partisan conflict had distracted from the substantive question of how to achieve accountability for Epstein's network. Intelligence officials, speaking anonymously, expressed concern about the broader implications of the confirmation battle. They noted that requiring nominees to commit to specific declassification decisions before taking office would fundamentally compromise intelligence operations. The concern extended beyond Epstein-related materials to the precedent that would be set for future nominees facing pressure to commit to releasing classified information for political purposes. 3 weeks following the hearing, Patel withdrew his nomination. The official statement cited the partisan nature of the confirmation process and the impossibility of receiving fair consideration from Democratic senators. However, multiple sources confirmed that Senate Republican leadership had privately conveyed that the votes for confirmation did not exist. Several moderate Republicans had indicated they could not support a nominee who had demonstrated such clear inconsistency between public statements and sworn testimony. The withdrawal represented a significant defeat for the incoming administration. Patel had been selected specifically because of his loyalty to Trump and his willingness to pursue aggressive action against perceived enemies. Finding a replacement who shared those qualities while being confirmable proved challenging. The eventual nominee, selected several weeks later, represented a more traditional law enforcement background with fewer controversial public statements, effectively abandoning the confrontational approach Patel represented. For Representative Raskin, the confrontation enhanced his reputation as an effective congressional investigator. Democratic activists celebrated his questioning technique as a model for holding Trump administration nominees accountable. He received invitations to speak at legal conferences about effective oversight questioning. His office reported a significant increase in campaign contributions from individuals who praised his performance during the hearing. The long-term institutional implications remained contested. Some commentators argued that forcing nominees to take clear positions on sensitive matters served the public interest by preventing bureaucratic evasion. Others contended that requiring specific commitments before nominees had access to classified information compromised their ability to make informed decisions. The debate reflected fundamental tensions about the balance between democratic accountability and operational effectiveness in intelligence and law enforcement institutions. The specific question of what the Epstein files contained and whether they should be released remained unresolved. The files continued to be subject to various classification authorities and ongoing litigation. Multiple congressional committees expressed interest in reviewing them, but obtaining access required navigating complex intelligence oversight protocols. The public fascination with the documents ensured that they would remain a point of political controversy regardless of Patel's failed nomination. For the broader confirmation process, the Raskin-Patel confrontation established a template that would be employed in subsequent hearings. Democratic senators began routinely asking yes or no questions designed to force nominees to either contradict their previous statements or take politically problematic positions. Republican nominees developed more sophisticated preparation strategies to avoid being trapped by such questioning. The procedural arms race reflected the increasingly adversarial nature of confirmation proceedings in a polarized political environment. The American public's reaction divided predictably along partisan lines. Polls showed that Republicans largely believed Raskin had been unfair to Patel, while Democrats felt the questioning was appropriate. Independents split based on their broader political orientation. The polarization extended to factual questions about what had occurred during the hearing, with different media outlets presenting fundamentally different narratives about the same events. The fragmentation of shared factual understanding represented a broader challenge for democratic governance. 1 year following the confrontation, political scientists began analyzing its impact on nomination dynamics. Studies examined whether the Raskin model of questioning had become normalized in confirmation hearings and whether it had affected the willingness of qualified candidates to accept presidential nominations. Preliminary evidence suggested that the increasingly contentious nature of confirmation proceedings had made some potential nominees reluctant to subject themselves to the process, potentially reducing the pool of available talent for government service. The episode also prompted renewed discussion about the appropriate standards for FBI director nominees. Former directors from both parties argued that the position required someone who could maintain operational independence while remaining accountable to elected officials. They emphasized that the director must resist political pressure to make decisions about specific investigations or releases of information. The tension between these principles and the reality of an increasingly partisan confirmation process remained unresolved. For viewers seeking to understand the mechanisms through which political accountability operates in contemporary American governance, this confrontation provides instructive lessons. The episode demonstrated how effective congressional oversight requires both substantive preparation and strategic questioning technique. It illustrated the challenges nominees face when their public rhetoric exceeds their willingness to make formal commitments. It revealed the extent to which confirmation hearings have become arenas for partisan conflict rather than sober evaluation of qualifications. The significance of this 5-minute exchange extended far beyond the immediate question of whether Patel would become FBI director. It represented a case study in how political norms evolve, how oversight functions in a polarized environment, and how individual moments can define both careers and institutional trajectories. The lasting impact will continue to be debated by scholars, practitioners, and citizens attempting to understand how American democracy functions under conditions of intense partisan division. For those interested in continuing analysis of political dynamics, governmental accountability, and the evolution of institutional norms, I encourage subscription to this channel to receive notification of subsequent content. Please share your perspective in the comments section regarding whether you believe Raskin's questioning technique represented appropriate oversight or prosecutorial overreach. Your engagement contributes to the broader democratic dialogue about how elected officials should be held accountable to the citizens they serve.